First, for the people who don't live and breathe politics, Peter, welcome to the show. I think first things first is, we have the BC Conservative Party leadership race going on, and we have a full field of candidates. And, you were the finance minister of the BC Conservative Party, but I kind of want to know who you are really, not the resume version. Who are you as a conservative, and what made you wake up one morning and say, I should lead this party?
Right. Thanks for the question, and thanks for having me on. And not to start off with corrections, but I don't want to mislead people. And I know that's not what you meant. I'm not
No.
a finance critic. I've never been the minister, unfortunately, or we wouldn't be in the financial mess we are in BC right now. So
Not the critic, the shadow. I meant to say shadow minister.
right. Yeah.
Sorry about that.
No,
Yeah.
I just like
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Never want viewers to think I'm resume fluffing. So there you go. But no, it's a valid question. It comes up quite a bit. Obviously, I've been in politics for quite some time. I was a city councillor for 6 years, a mayor for 9. Kept running my small business and coaching hockey and lacrosse at the same time. And then when an opening came up in 2017 to run provincially, I thought I should continue to try to advocate for my city and at a provincial level. And so it intrigued me, and I thought I would take on that challenge. And the electorate's been kind enough to elect me 8 straight times through all those various stages. So when I was looking at the possibility of running for leadership, obviously I need to have long conversations, as everyone should, with their family. And my wife and kids have always been very supportive throughout the years. And that was kind of a semi-foregone conclusion, but still serious conversations as well, because this is a much bigger and different commitment in terms of time and travel. And then I took a step back and said, do I have the skill set required to lead a party, to actually pull this province out of the mess that it's in, to still be able to protect those critical services that everyone relies upon while getting our fiscal house in order? And as I reflected on my life in both small businesses as well as politically, in terms of in and around the mayor's table and even within caucus, I realized I have the requisite skills. I have the history and the background and the track record. And I thought, I really should jump in, because I wouldn't feel right. I wouldn't sleep at night, right, if this race came and went, and I didn't at least attempt to offer up my skill set to the party membership and obviously to the broader public in a general election, to try to get things headed in the right direction in British Columbia for a change.
And I'm glad you said the right direction. And I think, when we look at NDP, the fiscal disaster of our last budget, there's been a lot of spin. And, let's look at the numbers. And as the shadow minister of finance, I think that you can appreciate this. Numbers don't lie. And, the NDP is running a $9.6 billion deficit this year. They're hoping to push a $13.3 billion for the following year. And that's not an accident. I think that that's a choice. And in your opinion, what does that level of deficit spending tell you about how NDP sees taxpayers?
Well, I think the NDPC taxpayers is just an unlimited source of revenue. And this year they've actually increased taxes almost $2 billion, mainly on the backs of seniors on fixed incomes, hardworking families, and small businesses. So despite all that extra taxation they keep bringing in, their deficits get higher. And that's a big problem. Normally, if you were running record deficits, it would be because you're trying to protect things we value, like healthcare and education, and revenues have dropped because it's something like a 2008 economic downturn. In this case, every year they've been collecting more and more tax revenue off of you, me, and every other taxpayer in British Columbia, and yet at the same time, ever growing deficits. And so when those two trajectories are complete opposite of each other, it's a very big problem, and it shows very clearly, and the bond rating agencies are saying very clearly that this government, frankly, has no clue how to manage the budget, how to manage the economy, how to grow the economy, and really all they know how to do is grow government.
No, fair enough. And I think, one thing I want to ask you, especially in your role, you have a unique perspective on finances. But, talking to the public, I think when you say 13 billion, it's very abstract. And when you talk about inflation, it's also abstract, especially for seniors. I don't think a lot of people understand that if you're a senior and you're dealing with inflation, that's actually eating away at your savings more than anyone else, because you're not your savings is fixed and you're not gaining on the inflation with the economy. It should be a fixed income. Why do you think it's hard for the regular person to understand inflation? And are we just not doing a good enough job at communicating like what these budgets and what these deficits mean to the regular, taxpayer?
Yeah, I think most people, I mean, they're more than smart enough to understand the implication. I think they're just, head down, so busy and worried about their own daily lives and their own household budgets that they entrust the people like myself that get elected are actually, overseeing the budgets in a responsible manner. If you ask them if they feel healthcare has gotten better over the last 8 years, they'll tell you no. And then when you tell them that the healthcare budget when the NDP took over was $17 billion and it's now 40, their jaw hits the floor. And that's when they start to realize the real implications of lack of result for the amount of taxation that they're seeing come off of their paychecks or off of their corporate bottom line. And so that's where I think people start to make the connections. And you're right. If I start talking to people about GDP growth and $13.3 billion deficit, a $250 debt load, and all of that, their eyes glaze over. If I mention to you a $16 orange juice, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And so, we saw this when I was at the city council level. If we were talking about rebuilding a $45 million sewage treatment plant, which at the time was the largest capital spend in Kamloops history, people criticized me for talking about that when I was running for mayor. Yet it was going to be our largest capital expenditure ever as a city. But if we talked about an extra $2 a month on your property tax to pay for a certain service, that could turn into a 9 month conversation around the council table. So I think it's just people, entrust those really big dollar conversations to the electeds, maybe unwisely sometimes because of what we see how it spins out of control. And it's really about them focusing and we have an ever-growing number of people going to the food bank in BC. I think a lot of British Columbians are worried, despite being gainfully employed, that they might be next. And they're sitting around their dinner tables wondering, why do I have to go to a food bank instead of a grocery store on my way home from work? And that's their burning desire. It doesn't necessarily translate to why is this government running a record deficit, but they do interconnect. It's just not necessarily in the here and the now in the people's consciousness.
Right. If you're looking at the gas pumps, I'm not sure what they are in Kamloops today, but looking at the prices as I drove by them today, I mean, $2.10 a liter. I mean, that says something, and I've talked to people on the street and some people are like, well, I can either feed my children at home or I can put gas in my gas tank. It's a travesty. And you're right. And that's what I like to connect is that you're right. It's when they hit them in the wallet that people actually understand the problems at home. What are your thoughts about right now, like with energy, the NDP's position, no pipelines? It seems like they're stalling on a lot of the projects. Before Mark Carney came out with, this expedited process, we were looking at about, permitting for mines for 10 to 15 years. Love to hear your thoughts about, the regulatory burden that projects and companies have to deal with in BC, and what's the path forward?
Yeah, there's a huge regulatory burden. And let's be clear, the premier demanded he needed Bill 15 passed to speed up projects. That was passed 9 months ago, and we're still waiting 9 months later for the regulations for that piece of legislation to speed up projects. So that's how this government actually views accelerating projects. We need to do this in a serious way because it's not just the $2 or $3 billion mine investment that's being hung up for 5 or 10 years extra. It's all the extra investment in a town that's in and around where those mines would operate, where you have a small motel operator wondering should they upgrade their 50-year-old motel or not. That's the final investment decision for that operator, not the same level, obviously, as a mine company, but important nonetheless. Or should a Tim Hortons franchise come to town? Should new houses get built in that town? All of those investment decisions get hung up as well. And that's that incremental increase we would see to the provincial revenues in terms of our overall economy, which actually would get us away from just being satisfied with being middle of the pack with GDP growth or almost hitting the target for what the economists say we should for an economy in any given year. And so that's where I think there's this missing connection with the provincial government, where they don't truly understand the real, when we say time is money, what that impact truly means in terms of the overall economy. They seem to be content with being mediocre. We have a premier that said he was okay with a D rating, a D grade for his budget. I don't care what the rest of the country's grade is. We're failing with that grade, and we should be actually having a premier that wants to excel and exceed and be a place where investment actually wants to come. And instead, by not getting these regulations out of the way, it's creating these problems. When I say get out of the way, if you're acknowledging that we need to speed things up for chosen projects, you've acknowledged you have a permitting problem. So how about we get the permitting problem fixed so that all projects can make the decision whether or not they're economically viable? What is the premier going to say if his chosen projects that he wants to accelerate, they suddenly decide their final investment decision for whatever reason, and they decide not to move forward? We've artificially delayed then all these other projects that might be more economically viable because they got pushed to the back of the line because one project seemed to be more politically palatable to try to garner headlines for an extra year or two.
Right. And I think that that's a fair point. I think that, looking at the way that, you were talking about Tim Hortons and investment in these small communities, I was looking at, the proposed pipeline that Daniel Smith is proposing from east to west, and they were proposing something, or they're estimating between 15,000 jobs. And a lot of those jobs, even in the downtown core, like you would have indirect jobs coming to Vancouver, to the metropolitan areas, even in Kamloops, where engineer jobs, a lot of consulting positions would open up, legal assessments. All of BC, in my opinion, would benefit from these projects. And to lead, especially when we're looking at a $13.3 billion deficit, it's the public service that supports the the private sector that supports the public sector. Hospitals, buses, everything that we take for granted as a public, and those are funded by those projects. So I don't understand this you know this lack of urgency, especially from David Eby, from the NDP. It almost seems like they think that this province is run on Starbucks and lattes, and that's just not the case. And I'm glad you brought up the regulatory burden, but we're also with the last year we also had the Cowichan decision, which has thrown land rights up in the air. We had the Musqueam, the federal position with the Musqueam in the Burrard Inlet and with water rights. And now we're seeing a lot of, these bans suing regulatory projects that are, halfway. I think I was looking at a project in Prince Rupert about 3 weeks ago, and they're being sued, and they're 70% away, 70% done the first phase of this project. Let me ask you a question, and obviously the Supreme Court's clear. We have a right to consult, but there is no right to veto. In your opinion, what does that mean to you, the right to consult? And I don't think a lot of people in British Columbia understand what that means. What can you explain that to me?
Yeah, and so this is fundamentally, the largest problem with DRIPA is how it has especially with Section 7 in DRIPA, turned things into a de facto veto on projects, especially how the government has been interpreting, enacting DRIPA and working within the confines that DRIPA does. And that's why we're saying everyone in this race is saying it needs to be repealed. Let's be clear. And the Conservative Party is saying we need to repeal it. And I campaigned in 2024 to repeal it. And I'm the only candidate in this race that actually got elected as a BC Conservative in 2024. And so this isn't a new position for me in the least. What we do need to do, and you touched on it, there is still a constitutional duty to consult, whether people like that or not. That was changed in 1982. And there was projects and there was consultation happening and there was projects moving forward pre-DRIPA. We can't lose sight of that. And what that means and what the province has done a very poor job of. Industry does a very good job of consulting. And what happens is the province cuts off the comment period of the consultation, and then another nation will come along and say, well, we'd like an extension. They grant that extension for the comment period, but a different project, a different nation asks for an extension, they get told no. So then they wonder why they didn't get an extension, but a different one did. Because again, the province starts to look like they're picking winners and losers. What we need to do is have a provincial government that for once fairly and consistently holds true to timelines. And nations will rally around that. I firmly believe they will be treated in good faith. with proper consultation, proper access to the information, proper timelines, things that have held up in previous Supreme Court rulings where nations have said we weren't properly consulted. And the courts have said, actually, you were. We've reviewed the timelines, the information provided, and that was acceptable to meet the threshold of proper consultation. So we do know there's a legally defensible position around these timelines. What we've never had is a government willing to stick to them. And obviously, if it's a rancher looking for range tenure, that's a less complicated process and a quicker timeline than a greenfield mine proposal. And so it's not a cookie cutter, one size fits all timeline framework that we need to work with. But I firmly believe that if we're working in good faith, the industry's working with good faith, when nations meet us at that table in good faith with consultation, we can still move projects forward. And there's all sorts of examples of that happening all over this province. And so that's what, DRIPA has kind of clouded the issue. We now see nations suing each other under the provisions of DRIPA. So it's not working as the government may have intended it to be, as they told us when we were in the legislature it would work. And so we just need to acknowledge that and say it's a piece of legislation that's not working. It does not, DRIPA never did enshrine Indigenous rights in a constitutional way. The Constitution does that. And so repealing it also does not strip away any of those constitutional rights that Indigenous communities have. But that's how we can still move this economy forward. That's how we can provide certainty to projects. It doesn't mean a rubber stamp yes or an automatic no. It means the government will get back into the business of actually being the final decision maker based on all the information provided in a timely fashion, both from Indigenous nations in the area as well as the project that wants to proceed.
I think, like if you were looking at indigenous nations, I think that they want that partnership, and I don't understand how you could be opposed to having prosperity within these communities, especially when you look at the economic advantages of these projects and especially the offshoots, the partnerships of these communities. What would it take for the business communities to see, like, as a signal from the provincial government that we are open for business? Like, what in your opinion right now is not working? Obviously we've touched on a few of them. Do you have any ideas on like what else isn't working in terms of the business side of our province, and what would signal to the business community that we are open for business? Because right now it seems like David Evie under the NDP is no, no, no before we even get to maybe.
Yes. Yeah, there's a wide range of sectors that we need to look at. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that the housing sector was kind of the barometer for economies around North America, and post 2008, we've kind of walked away from that as a standard. But it is still a critical part of the overall economy and an indicator of economic health in any economy. And so there's you look at this government for years has talked about trying to speed up and make housing more efficient and more productivity into that sector. Our least productivity of any sector in our economy right now is in construction while we're in the middle of a housing crisis. And that's why I've proposed that we would bring in in-stream application protection on builders so that they know actually what their fees are paying for as they're working through a project are, and they don't keep getting changed by various levels of government. Why we would freeze the step code at step 3 so they actually can adjust to what the industry needs and for fuel efficiency of homes, but also not adding an extra $50,000 to $70,000 by unilaterally just going to step 5. That's why we would bring in a true one permit process on housing. And most importantly, I would bring in only one BC building code. Right now, municipalities can put extra layers on the BC building code, which creates this weird patchwork where your engineers and your framers and your drywallers and your insulators, everyone has to work to a different standard from town to town to town, and doesn't create efficiencies when you're trying to build. In terms of mines and larger projects, we need to signal that we are legitimately committed to streamlining permitting applications. A lot of that is setting out real and makeable timelines and actually being held accountable in a very public way if we're making those timelines or not playing games with when the clock starts. That's what the NDP has done with permits. They moved when they consider the clock to start running, and then they say they sped up the process. Well, 10 years is still 10 years if you're the mining project and the investors trying to float a 10-year project that should really only be a 2.5-year process. And so those are the areas we can do with that. We need to meaningfully address taxation for light manufacturing and other businesses so that people that want to invest and grow our economy actually feel like they're wanted here and that we're actually in a tax competitive jurisdiction, not just in North America, but within Canada. If we are removing interprovincial trade barriers, which I fully support us doing, if we are not a competitive tax jurisdiction, all that light manufacturing will move to an Alberta or Saskatchewan and just ship their finished product back into BC as opposed to manufacture it in BC. It's these types of steps that we have to do, and it's more than one, but they're all related, and they're all the signals you need to send that you truly are a government that's open for business and wants to actually encourage entrepreneurship and expansion and not just talk about it.
I'm glad you brought up those, because those are it doesn't make sense to me why we have so much regulatory burden, especially for construction. Why is the bylaws different from Metro Vancouver than they are in Surrey? It makes no sense. When we're looking at, and I had a funny notice to my complex, was that our building needs to now do a carbon tax assessment for a building. We're just living in this home, and now the city of Vancouver wants to burden, people that are living within their city with a like a carbon footprint on their building. It just seems so ridiculous to me, especially with the cost of living, especially with the affordability crisis that we were dealing with in Vancouver. And not only that, but like, if you are just a young homeowner coming into, if you were able to scrape by and actually buy a place in Vancouver. I was out last night and we were asking, one of the bartenders, where she lives, and she was saying she lives in a 400 square foot apartment, or excuse me, studio, and pays $1,800. There's no bedroom in that. It's a studio, 400 square feet, $1,800. Like, where in the world else are you paying for that square footage? So it's mind boggling to me that we've gotten to this situation, but going back to what you're saying about, the regulatory burden, what do you see the path forward in there for the regulatory burden? Like, do you think that, like, we need to introduce, like, take more power away from the municipalities? Do we need to restructure Metro Vancouver as a whole in terms of these permittings? Like, you look at what's going on in North Van. We have a sewage plant that's running, in the billions of dollars. I'm curious what your thoughts on those regulatory issues.
Yeah, I think it's a fine line. Again, as a former mayor and city councilor, I'm mindful, but I was also chair of our regional board, which is the same as Metro Vancouver, and we actually cut costs. We reduced the number of committees people were on, and it didn't cost me becoming the chair. I kept getting reelected as the chair. So I do think there are ways you can work with elected officials to truly streamline and get them to buy in and make things more efficient. That sewage treatment plant I mentioned in Kamloops that we did while I was the mayor, by the way, we delivered that on time and on budget. I think people in North Vancouver might like to know how he actually can accomplish something like that for core infrastructure. And the key to all of that is I think we have over the years, as much as we talk about provincial downloading on municipalities, which is a very real thing, we also have mayors and councils that have decided to take on and tackle things that are outside of their scope voluntarily and not focus in on some of those key areas of the mundane kind of day in day out obligations that a mayor and a council are actually supposed to oversee to make sure a city is running properly and efficiently. And so that ties into all of this. How do we bring in efficiencies to things like housing? How do we bring in efficiencies at the governance level while still providing that autonomy? But saying, okay, look, I don't know why they brought in provisions to allow municipalities to have more say over the BC Building Code than something called the BC Building Code, but they did. The problem is over the years, it's become unwieldy and it's no longer providing efficiencies, and you're hard pressed to find out why it is that is needed. Do you need to have local autonomy to better figure out the complexities of the pressure zones you need to provide proper water and fire hydrant flows through the water system, and make sure you have the right pressure zones and volumes for your sewage system, make sure you have the right road networks and volumes for subdivisions that are going to go in? Absolutely, you need to have those types of planning autonomies for a local government because it's too complex for one size fits all with the geography we have in British Columbia. So I think we have to start to recognize there's legitimate areas that cities still need to have that planning control over. And then there's other areas that we need to kind of say, okay, enough's enough. And work in partnership to remove some of those barriers to the efficiencies that we do see from city to city. Kamloops is one of the most complex water systems in North America. We have more rise out of one water plant than even San Francisco has. And we have to have pressurized systems on the other side. So, you couldn't have a provincial government saying, well, this shall be on how you're going to do something as critical as water provisions. So that's, a lot of what I talk about. I draw upon my experiences within governing in the past. And yes, a city of Kamloops is nowhere near the size or complexity of the province of BC. But it's just an order of magnitude at a certain point. The fundamentals are the fundamentals. A balance sheet is a balance sheet, and departments that all interconnect with a overall global budget. And there's capital and there's operating. Yes, it doesn't. There's different zeros on the balance sheet, but it doesn't take me that much longer to read an extra zero or two on any particular line item compared to what I'm used to doing when I was the mayor for almost a decade.
Right, and I think you touched on it before, and I like that you brought it up, and you mentioned interprovincial trade, and that they're going to be taking the manufacturing out of BC and doing it in other provinces. One thing that really strikes me in a different not different in a different not hemisphere, but like when you look at the industrial carbon tax and all of these regulatory burdens that we put on industry here in Canada, you can almost say the same thing, that we almost promote manufacturing in countries like China, India, that don't have like the same regulatory burden when it comes to the environment, the same labor standards that we have here in Canada. And at the same time, we don't here in Canada tax those imports at the same level that we tax our industry here in Canada. And it almost seems to me like it's a shell game, like that we have, we have our carbon here, and I'm just going to put it right here, and then I'm going to just move it over to China. Honestly, I don't understand that, how, like we saw this introduced with Gordon Campbell, the carbon tax, and then we saw the final antithesis of this with David Eby, them removing it. And, but at the same point in time, like, what does that do to promote manufacturing here in Canada? It doesn't, because again, we're not competitive on the world stage. You mentioned interprovincial trade barriers. Let me ask you a question. Did those go far enough in your opinion?
The removal, no, I think we've missed the window, frankly. And the premier and Minister Callan will talk a good game, but there was a real push when the trade war started with the tariffs to really meaningfully remove them. We didn't see the province take the bull by the horns and challenge the other provinces. We did see some other provinces try to do that, and BC didn't accept the challenge to truly and meaningfully remove the barriers. And so when you drag these things out, what happens is invariably one sector that has a little more political influence in a province will say, well, okay, we can open things up, but not our sector. And then a different province, the same thing happens, and the same thing happens. And next thing you know, you have everybody kind of putting their lines in the sand, and you have this mismatch of rules that still impact people. And so I think we have, unfortunately, missed some of that political impetus that might have been there before. It doesn't mean we don't keep trying and keep trying to remove them, but we have to be realistic about this. And when we have the virtue signaling around banning American booze, but they don't do anything to meaningfully address the issues we're hearing from the wine industry in BC, from the craft distilling industry in BC, and from the craft brewers in BC, it's a half measure again, instead of doing the hard work of actually helping shore up those light manufacturing industries, because that's what they are. They ignored it and did a more performative banning of U.S. liquor on a liquor store. And so again, I think the public and the economy actually needs real substantive action being taken, not this performance art that we keep seeing coming out of the BC NDP.
No, fair enough. I'm glad you brought that. I agree with that, because I was in Ontario, I think, 6 months ago, and I was surprised to see in all of their liquor stores, no BC wine. And we have some of the best wines, like, in North America. And it just surprised me to see, like, why are we promoting that type of product in other provinces? And I'm glad you understand that. When we talk to conservatives, Peter, another flashpoint that gets brought up is education. And right now, it almost seems like parents are no longer stakeholders in their children's education. whether or not you agree with SOGI or not at the same point in time. Like when you looked back at 20 years when I went to school and when you were dealing with, Molly, I had Molly and Johnny in my, grade one class, and they got pulled out for a week. And what were we learning about that week? Well, we were learning about dinosaurs, and maybe their parents didn't agree with that part of the curriculum. Now, when we're in 2026, and we have these divisive programs like SOGI, and the parents no longer have a say in whether or not they agree with that platform. And whether or not you agree with it or not, the program is not a curriculum; it's a tool. I'd like to hear what your thoughts on that program are. And do you think that there needs to be more consultation with the parents and make them stakeholders again?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I campaigned in 2024 to repeal SOGI, and the reason we're still talking about it not being repealed or DRIPA being repealed is because we didn't form government. And that's why this leadership race in this next general election is so critical. And I say this everywhere I go is, we can get the leadership right and we can win a general election and we can actually make some changes. Or I can be back in these rooms 2 years from now. We can all be talking about the same things that are frustrating us. And that's really our choice we have as conservatives moving forward here. In terms of SOGI, yes, it's become a flashpoint. There's not all, but many teachers have taken things way too far in terms of age appropriateness or how they are moving forward within the classroom of what they are saying to the kids, especially at the younger ages. And we're hearing more and more of that. And so, it needs to have a relook. It needs to get things back to a place where people are more comfortable. Absolutely. We have to keep in mind there's a basic fundamental, though, that all kids should feel safe and protected at school and not be subject to bullying or harassment or unsafe conditions, be it based on race or religion or gender or gender identity. And so that has to still always form a large basis of anything that comes next. But we do need to better inform parents. I recognize fully that there's a lot of parents that don't engage like they used to back in, your time in school or my time in school. But that doesn't mean you don't give the option to those parents that do want to be meaningfully engaged within their classrooms, within their kids' education, and know what's going on while their kids are away from home. And so I think, the pendulum has swung much too far the other way. And that is why it's going to be hard work with the BCTF. Let's face it, there will be a great amount of pushback. But this isn't about, not teaching kids or not keeping kids safe. This is about making sure that we get things back to an age appropriate level and a learning environment that makes families feel like their kids are learning the basic fundamentals first and foremost, and leave a lot of those more social societal learnings to home and to other influences in that child's life.
Right. No, and I think that, there's no doubt about it. I think everyone wants to feel safe. I think that that's not the problem. And I think what SOGI has evolved to is beyond safety and bullying at this point. I think that, when we look at, my buddy was telling me about, his kid, and his kid doesn't know what anxiety was. And then, he hears about anxiety, and now he has anxiety every day for like a full blown 10 days. I think that we have a lot, like kids are more impressionable. And I think that, maybe we could get back to kids being kids again. And I would like to see that, as a parent, I'd like to hold these hard issues for a lot later rather than introduce them earlier, like what I've been seeing in the school system. But that's, and I don't want to digress on that. I respect your position. Right now, you own a small business. You own a small chain in a hotel in Kamloops, correct?
I sold, my wife and I sold everything, the last remnants of the businesses in about early 2018, I guess was when
Okay.
everything sold. Yeah, yeah. So,
So I didn't know. So how
no,
does
no,
that
no
shape?
worries.
Yeah, how does that shape your perspective today? Because obviously you run a business. How does that? Do you see that business being run from 2018 to now? Like, what do you think the burdens are for small businesses in BC? Because for me, when I look at like starting a business, it almost seems like the barrier to entry is astronomical now. Like there's so many
Yeah.
regulatory burdens. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I grew up in that family business, and so I was literally 9 years old and sweeping the parking lot, and I had done any and every job you could possibly do in a hotel. Was a night audit for a lot of years. helped do the books. As I was finishing up high school, I, was management. I was not management. I was all over the place, and it taught me a lot. And when I was in my early 80s, when interest rates went to 23%, our hotel was only a few years old, massive mortgage on it, and a lot of stress. And it was about the only hotel in Kamloops that didn't go through one level of receivership over that time period. And
Wow.
and that was based on a lot of the hard work my mom, who was self-taught in the hotel industry, did, and the hours she put in, and the work ethic I saw from her and my dad. So I have a lot of appreciation and understanding and fear and worry from my own operational days of running a business. And I can totally understand why small businesses feel neglected. And we have a small business community that was begging for help, and this year's budget, instead of help, they got increased costs. And a premier who shrugged and laughed it off and said, if anyone wants to move to, I'm paraphrasing, well, but if you're going to close up your business and move to Alberta because we're charging you 7% on your accounting fees, well, so be it. That it just shows a state of mind of an uncaring and a lack of understanding by a premier that's never actually literally wondered which bill are you paying tomorrow, and you hope you have a busy day so you have enough cash come in the door so you can actually pay this bill or that bill. So there's a lot we can do. Again, if you have a small business in BC, your payroll costs, your governmental costs are 30% higher than anywhere else in Canada. If you try to grow your business from 5 employees to 25 employees, that goes up by 700%. So we are actually being punitive to those that are striving to actually grow their business a bit and have a few extra staff and grow. So we need to actually meaningfully address that competitiveness of a small business owner to encourage them to reinvest in their own business, to actually grow their business and feel like they'll be supported. But if we also don't impact crime and safety on our streets at the exact same time, if we don't make people feel like they're safer to walk to those small stores and go get a coffee, or your wife and your daughter feel safe walking around at dusk in a business district or in and around a park area, those small businesses are still going to struggle, and they'll be under more and more pressure from the Amazons of the world. We need to bring consequence back into our criminal justice system so that people that are perpetually shoplifting or perpetually breaking windows and damaging storefronts are constantly using the front of stores as a place to relieve themselves. Really, we need to get a handle on that, or the economic help to small businesses will only be a drop in the bucket. And just so your viewers understand, when I say a cost impact to small businesses, so they've added 7% PST to bookkeeping services and to accounting services for a small business. If you're a small business that's had to hire security for all those crime and safety issues I've just been talking about, this government has decided, instead of helping you, to charge you 7% PST on the cost of your security guards. That is how out of touch this government has become with the true struggles of small businesses and the real threat they face on the economic competitive side, on the crime and safety and disorder side, but also the real world online shopping threat that they face from the Amazons of the world. If we do not create, that safe feeling environment and competitive environment.
Well, I also think that it also discourages people from actually visiting these areas as well. Before, several years ago, I know being in Vancouver, a lot of my girlfriends say, like, we just don't feel safe in the city anymore. And it's a, and I don't know how we've, obviously I know how we've gotten here with the revolving criminal justice system that is what we have here in Canada. It contributes a lot to that. Right now, we're seeing a lot of, extortion here in Surrey, and I'm glad you brought up public safety. We see a lot of this or these extortions that are going on in Surrey. There was another report that came out in the Globe and Mail where some of these schools that are coming into Vancouver, they're actually hiring some of these international students to get visas, and they're using these students for the extortions. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's no doubt the extortion threat is real, and that we need to see meaningful actions taken. We've seen Vancouver, frankly, do a reasonably good job in trying to keep things under control compared to what we see unfolding in Surrey. It is good to see some of the shooting, the more public aspect of the extortion situation seems to have calmed down. But let's not kid ourselves that there is, in all likelihood, still threats and other actions being taken behind the scenes that store owners or the public aren't aware of. And so, again, that whole crime and safety piece, we need to actually have a premier that the federal government, regardless of who the prime minister is, actually wants to work with on things that are of vital, critical importance to British Columbia. And right now, it appears that the federal government is distancing themselves and walking away from a premier that they don't really like working with. And so that matters because we need to start seeing real and meaningful consequence brought in to violent crime, violent extortion type attempts. We need to see a restructuring of the rules. And I know it gets complicated with international law, but not trying is not an option. I don't care what your country of origin is. If you are not a permanent resident or anything above that standing, and you're accused or charged, most importantly, charged with very serious violent offenses, you should be sent home. You can be represented by your BC lawyer in a BC courtroom, and you can appear by Zoom, so you can still have due process. But it doesn't mean you have to be wandering the streets of British Columbia while that due process unfolds, as you've been charged with a very serious criminal offense, and you have no technically legal standing in British Columbia at the time. And I don't care if you're from Australia. I don't care if you're from Europe. It doesn't matter country of origin, China, India. It doesn't matter about country of origin. It's about the deed that you're being accused of and charged with. Because we lay so few charges in this province now, frankly, at a certain point where the Crown's willing to lay a charge, whether it results in a conviction or not, they're obviously pretty confident somebody is somehow involved or somehow been connected in that it's enough to try to take them to court. So it's steps like that we need to address on the violent side. The same could be said for fentanyl trafficking in terms of pressuring the federal government to get stiffer and more meaningful sentences brought in and not just treat fentanyl trafficking like it's the same as other older, maybe old school type drugs. Their societal repercussions from fentanyl are much more wide ranging and destructive than drugs we've seen in the past. And I think we have to start treating the legal system to view them in that same view.
I think that you're absolutely correct. One thing I will touch upon is I think that, I have family that deal with drug addiction, and one thing I will say is that they will get clean when they get incarcerated, but then as soon as they get released, there is no tools for them. Like they say that we're going to have a treatment center, but that center is like 2 to 3 weeks out from your release. So in those 2 to 3 weeks, those 2 to 3 weeks, they have, there's no resources, and there's a high likelihood of reoffending within that 2 to 3 weeks. So I think that, obviously there needs to be tools outside of the incarceration. And I think that maybe the idea that we give, the community safe drugs probably isn't the end all be all, because we've seen that play out, with the hydromorphone that went into public school system, or not public school system, but went out to youth because obviously, it wasn't as strong enough as fentanyl. If you look at 2021 to 2022, I think that the youth fatality rate for overdosing on hydromorphone was 2%. And then as soon as they introduced safe supply in 2023, I think that jumped up to about 1/3 of all youth related deaths was about 33%. So it does say that, maybe we need to have more tools and more a different approach is probably what I would like to see in the community, and maybe follow the Alberta model. What are your thoughts on what they're doing?
Yeah, I think Alberta's headed on the right path on this. Frankly, there's a large upfront cost to make sure you have proper accreditation and services for people. But ultimately, when you track the reduced cost to the healthcare system, to the reduced emergency room wait times, people not feeling in danger when they're in an emergency room because of other unstable people that are in there, policing costs, court costs, you name it. But it is complicated, and it needs a true cohesive plan of attack. So, by the time someone gets to the downtown east side condition, they don't start drugs and wind up there, the next day. We have to be honest about that. There's a lot of people that, especially through work-related injuries and that, especially in the construction industry, wind up self-medicating when their prescriptions run out from pain management, and then they want to get clean and they try and they find out they have to wait 6 weeks. And so, they keep using, and then that 6 week window closes and they suddenly say, I'm not ready to go to voluntary treatment anymore. I'm fine. I can get this under control. We all know where the end point is, and it is the downtown east side or areas like that in any other city. If you don't get things under control, when they can still get healthy, get clean, have their loved ones supporting them still, and they haven't frankly burned a lot of bridges in their family life. And so what we have is a mass shortage of voluntary care right now. So we need to meaningfully address that. And that's what Alberta has done very well in terms of people say they need treatment, and be it a public space or a private space, that space is opened up for the person immediately. So they can try to get on the right path and get healed up while it's still a much more achievable target and goal. By the time they get to the downtown east side stage, their physiology has changed in terms of their spine and everything else. Their mental capacity has changed because of, in all likelihood, several non-fatal overdoses and the brain damage that comes with that. So we have to be realistic about involuntary care for those that can't care for themselves anymore, instead of having them wandering around rainy, cold streets, getting preyed upon by the drug dealers out there and beaten and violence and everything else. So we need both of those to happen in unison, because I would rather catch the person and get them stabilized and healthy while they still have a fighting chance to do that. And, and the third piece to this is the housing component. We have a BC Housing that refuses to fund dry housing for those that want to live in a collective while they're still taking their next steps and to get back into main society in a healthy and productive way. They get released from treatment or detox, and they wind up having to live in housing, BC Housing, that has drug dealers living on floors, that has drug use happening everywhere and alcohol happening everywhere. And no wonder they don't stay clean, because they're walking by this chaos to get to their own apartment. In Kamloops, we had a lot just recently that the housing providers that do provide housing for those types of situations wanted to make this new build dry housing. BC Housing added in an addendum to the RFP that said it had to allow drug use, it had to allow alcohol use, it had to be under the rental tenancy branch, which would make it next to impossible to evict people in any timely way that are causing chaos. So here you have the housing provider themselves saying we need more housing for people that are just trying to live collectively in a clean, healthy way. I'm not saying we don't need some housing that obviously allows that transition. But why does 100% of BC Housing have to be that way? Why can we not have a percentage of it that does allow for people that are desperately trying to stay clean and sober and productive to stay that way? And the response was to add that addendum in, not just for Kamloops, but they inserted it into every other BC housing project across the province about 6 months ago. And so that is not a government that truly believes that recovery and treatment is actually a viable path forward for people. Meanwhile, I have known lots of people in my lives, as we all do, that have either struggled with alcohol or the drugs and managed to get clean and are have been clean for long, long periods of time. Yes, they have the odd stumble here or there, especially in the earlier stages, but they've maintained it and they've stayed very healthy and productive, not just members of society, but within their own families. That's what we should be striving for. But this government really hasn't accomplished on either side of that.
No, I think I absolutely agree with everything you're saying, Peter. I struggle to understand that why we're providing housing for vulnerable people without positive outcomes. You know what I mean? Like, there is no dignity. You go down to, you mentioned the downtown east side. There is no dignity in watching someone withdraw from fentanyl, having them bent over and seeing them physically withdraw. There is no dignity in that. And to say that it seems like this topic of safe supply. I don't see it as safe supply. I see it as we're perpetuating harm, because what we're doing to these people is and what I think is criminal. Like, you're perpetuating misery to this population. And when we talk about vulnerable populations, like, you mentioned people getting clean. I can't imagine what that was like, but I'd imagine they had resources available to themselves to get clean. And then when you look at people that are very vulnerable, especially those that are on the downtown east side, and even in Kamloops, I'd imagine people that don't have families, that don't have resources, they suffer imaginable barriers to get clean. And the fact that, like you mentioned it, you're in talking about housing, now you're putting these people that are, they've gotten clean, or they're ready to get clean, and then you put them into a situation where there's drugs available to them through their drug dealer or through their pharmacy. It's almost criminal to me, and then, I don't want to keep getting much longer here, Peter, but I do want to talk about past leadership. Conservative Party BC. It's we're in a great place right now. The next leader is very likely going to be in the next premier, and you look at what happened with the BC Conservative Party. We had two MLAs make this the official opposition. And they dismantled the BC United, and it almost seems like the BC Conservative Party is an indictment of the past leadership, or the BC United, BC Liberal policies, and how they looked at SOGI in terms of perpetuating that, Aaron Gunn not embracing him as leader for the BC Liberals when he did his leadership race. But we look at John Rustad more recently and, his mistakes. What do you think, like, the biggest mistakes as leader he did? And if you were leader, what would you have done differently?
Yeah, I get along great with John, and at least I think I do. I sat next to him for the first 3.5 years I was in the legislature, and so every leader has a different style, and ultimately, history and time decides whether that was the right style for the time frame we were in or not. And like with any leader, some things are directly the leaders, doing. Sometimes it's people around them. Sometimes it's a combination. But ultimately, when you're the leader, you wear it all. And so, my style is a little bit different than John's, I would say. I certainly have always worked well with everyone that's in any caucus I've been in. I've always worked well with groups of elected officials. I firmly believe in enabling, in a good way, enabling, caucus members or cabinet members or shadow ministers or whatever role they have to really take the ball and run with what their responsibilities are. And so I think ultimately that cuts through and garners me a fair amount of respect within the rooms that I'm in. And that's how I see myself continuing to move forward. We have a great amount of talent in our caucus. We would need to add, obviously, even more talent to be able to win a general election. And I think that sets us up very well with the proper mentoring and enabling that growth to happen within themselves, within their roles, to actually set the stage for another 15 or 20-year governing window, as we always see with the right of center in BC when we coalesce and we really develop that talent from within. So I'm quite excited about the future with the BC Conservatives. I see this.
Peter?
I just had a call coming through. I had to cancel
problem.
theirs.
So, one thing I will say is, like, we look at the way that, John Ross said, and there's probably a lot of mistakes made. One of them was probably, you represent a part of that in your riding, was Lindsay Shepherd. She spoke out about unmarked graves, 215. And, there's been money that's been spent on these graves. And, and right now there's debate, there's skepticism, there's emotion. Let me ask you, how do you respond to that? And what role should an MLA play as this process continues?
Yeah, you know what? I think everyone does want the truth. I think even the First Nations want the truth. Obviously, I can totally understand where people are wanting to have more clarity and updates around timelines. What has been expended to so far, what is the game plan moving forward, and what is the ultimate timeline for discovery of any remains or not, and what does that look like. So I totally do get where the public headspace is at with that. I also understand the complexities of what we're talking about in terms of, in the case of Kamloops, the number of nations that had kids sent to that school and them trying to figure out records ahead of time before any excavation might start. So I think it's one of these cases, though, where people are starting to ask those questions, and I do hope that there's more conversation or timeline and information provided than what we've had provided to this point. But it's not about, to me, it's not about, the numbers or potential numbers. It's about, okay, what is the timeline and how is this going to unfold moving forward?
You mentioned timeline. Like, what would a reasonable timeline be? Like, what would we, the public, and the reason I bring this up, I'm not trying to give anyone a hard time, but the problem is, obviously there's the skepticism. And I think that, everyone just wants some transparency. Like, did the money go the right way? Is there graves? And if there is graves, let's deal with it. Let's investigate. Let's find to the bottom of that. What is a reasonable timeline for the public, for the First Nations, for these victims to have justice?
Yeah, no, and that's a great question. I honestly don't know what would be that timeline in terms of that complexity. I think not knowing, there's the 12 million, which is obviously federal money, and it's not provincial money. So there's limited ability to get that transparency there. We saw the redacted documents. And I think, again, that just leads at a time where there is skepticism. I think we do need to, say, okay, hang on, is it really that all 12 has been spent? Is it that only 2 has been spent and 10 is still sitting there for the actual excavation? No one actually knows. And I think that's what leads into this extra questioning. And that's where I say a little bit more of just clear answers and clear timeline and clear direction and clear understanding of what has or hasn't truly transpired and what the next steps are. I think that would go a long way, and then people would understand, even if we may not agree with what an appropriate timeline is, but we at least all know what the targeted timeline actually is versus, then getting into back and forth about what an actual timeline should or shouldn't be.
Respectfully, Peter, thank you so much. Peter, I thank you for your time. These are serious questions and serious moments for this province, and I appreciate you laying out where you stand. Let's be clear, this leadership race, it isn't theoretical. It's whether BC Conservative movement can unify, sharpen its message, and actually defeat David Eppie in the next election. Voters are watching closely, and they're not looking for slogans. They're looking for clarity and conviction, Peter, and thank you so much. To everyone, tune in. This is part of our BC Conservative leadership interview series. We're sitting down with every serious candidate, giving them the same opportunity to make their case directly to you. If you've found this valuable, share it, stay engaged. The direction of this province depends on who leads it next. Peter, where can people find you? And if they want to make a difference in this province, like, what's the best way?
Sure. PeterMilobar.ca, Milobar. That's my website, and very easy to find. And all my socials are the same. I was on social media as an elected very early, so I was able to protect my name all the way through. Just very simple and straightforward. So yeah, that's the easiest way to contact the campaign. You can only vote in this race if you're a party member for any candidate. So do get engaged. April 18th is the cutoff for membership. Make sure you have your BC Conservative membership, and then May 9th to the 30th will be the actual vote. So I do encourage listeners and viewers to actually get informed, find out. It's a ranked ballot, so I don't have to be your first choice. It could be your second or your third choice, and that's fair enough. That's what this is about: is growing the party, growing the grassroots, hearing from the people, and taking that direction forward with whoever wins this race.
Peter, thank you so much. And we'll have all the links below. Thank you.
Thank you. Anytime.
Just hold.
If you're still here, good. It means you're paying attention. It means you're not asleep. You're not gaslit. You haven't been bought by the media spin or the liberal fairy tale that everything is fine while the country burns. I'm Dan Knight, and this is The Opposition. They have the consultants, they have the lobbyists, they have the legacy press, CBC, CTV, Global, spoon-feeding you government-approved talking points like it's North Korea, but with a better wardrobe. But we have each other. We've got the truth, we've got the grit, and we have the absolute audacity to stand up and say, no more. No more fake budgets, no more climate virtue signaling while our economy crumbles. No more surrendering your sovereignty to Brussels, Beijing, or Beltway elites. You can find me on Substack or Twitter, Dan Knight MMA, or on Instagram, and wherever honest Canadians are still allowed to speak freely. If you like what you heard, like it, share it, send it to someone who still thinks for themselves. We are building something here, not just commentary, but a coalition, a resistance to the rot, a community that refuses to bow, bend, or beg for permission. They have the legacy media, but we have you. And if we stick together, they don't stand a chance. Let's make it count. I'll see you on the next episode of The Opposition.